Yvonne, good morning everybody. It's great to be back here again after a few years break and to see all of you here today. So as Yvonne said, a couple of things. I am going to leave room for questions and time for questions. I've got about 7 or 8 slides, that's all this morning. And it's a big topic, right? Sustainable procurement and modern slavery in 20 minutes. But that's okay because I think a lot of you know a lot of I'm going to take a lot of presumed or assumed knowledge. So you will know what sustainable procurement is and basically what modern slavery is. So I'm going to point you in the direction of some good resources and give you an update on modern slavery because there's a bit to say about that actually, which is really good. But I'm going to leave some time for questions. So please do jump on Slido and ask them. Whether it's about modern slavery, sustainable procurement or something else, feel free just to fire them up. So let me kick off with my presentation, and that was a lovely cause and a great segue into my talk this morning on sustainable procurement and modern slavery, as I say. So, first of all, sustainable procurement. I don't want to sort of go over things that everybody knows, but this is still not done all that well, which is when people procure, in government in particular, there is often still a real focus on cost and just cost rather than more than cost. And we've all got this value for money imperative, right? So whatever rules bind you, legislation binds you, or whatever policies that bind you, value for money is at the heart of your purchases if you're a government entity. Corporate entity it ought to be, but you're not required to do that. But as a public sector entity, you do. And so we've got to sort of stop focusing as much on costs, and there has been a big move. I started in procurement about 25 years ago, and really that's all it was back then. Let's go for the cheapest complying tender, and that was then. This is now, and now we need to say, well, how much is it? How much is it actually in total? So that's whole of life costing. So that's moved, and it really needs to be looked at. There's acquisition cost, and there's whole of life cost. And if all you do is look at acquisition cost, then you miss out on 4 categories, or 3 categories. So there are 4 categories of costs. Acquisition is one of them, and there are 3 others. And you've got to look at those. That's operations, maintenance, and disposal, basically. So you've got to look at those, and there's a big, long list of things that go into those costs. So when you look at what something's going to cost you, you need to look at it in total across its life and a life cycle costing, total cost of ownership. We'll call it what you will, but that's what we're talking about. So I know a lot of you would do that well, but some people still don't fully get that and don't do that all that well, but we have to. So that's the first thing. Cost is a bit more complicated than some people give it credit for. The other thing is we now need to look very closely at sustainable procurement, and that brings into play not just cost or profit, but also people and planet. So profit, people, planet, the 3 Ps of sustainable procurement. And profit is cost. That's what that is in that bucket, but we've got people and planet as well. So that's social and environmental. You'll see an image up there, and there's a lot of really good things around that you can get, and there's also a lot of rubbish on the internet, as we all know. So it's good to get like tips of good stuff. This document up here is probably one of the best things I've read in recent times on sustainable procurement. Published by the Commonwealth Government, and I know there wouldn't be many people from Commonwealth Government in here, but it doesn't matter because it's all about sustainable procurement, broken down into the 5 stages of procurement. The go-to-market stage, the tendering sort of period, the assessment stage, the entering into the contract, and the contract management. And it talks about what sustainable procurement is, it defines it, and it is written for Commonwealth Government who have to comply with it, but if you're an organisation trying to implement sustainable procurement in what you do, this would be a great thing to look at. At the back of it, it's got model clauses, model tender schedules, all these great things that can really help you. Okay, so I thoroughly recommend that resource to you, and when these slides are circulated, there's a hyperlink to it just there. That's the sustainable procurement piece. And I start off like that, and I've got people highlighted up there in green because I'm getting modern slavery at home. And as I've mentioned before, for those of you that might have heard me talk about it, you've got procurement as a broad umbrella, 3 pillars of procurement, people, planet, profit, and then within that there's a thin slice, modern slavery, which lives in the people. There's a lot more to social procurement than modern slavery, but that's where modern slavery kind of lives in those. So if you think about procurement like that, like I do. So that's why I wanted to start like that, give it some context, and now we'll move on to modern slavery. So, modern slavery, it's been around for a while now actually, but things change and things move on, as I say, and there's some good updates to give you today. But the trouble with it being around for a little while is people just there was a lot of activity about it. I was doing so much work for clients and entities on modern slavery, just modern slavery, in 2018, 2019. Does it apply to me? What does it require me to do? How can I comply with this? What happens if I don't comply with it? All these questions. And then everybody kind of understood it, and that's good. So that advice piece sort of dropped away, and that's fine. And then they moved on to doing their modern slavery statement. And then it can become, and has become, a bit of set and forget. Well, we've done our first modern slavery statement, so that'll do for the next year and the next year and the next year. But actually, it's not the case. Year 1 should be what it is. Year 2, go a bit deeper into your supply chain, start talking about remediation practices for modern slavery that you identify in your supply chains. Year 3, do better, do more. And it's got to sort of be informed by the previous year's findings. So that the next year should be, it should move, and it should improve, and it should update the statements. Okay, so that's sort of just a bit about, people sort of think they've got it all together with modern slavery, but actually they don't. And because there was this big flow of activity, and now it has died off to some extent, and it really can't, for very many reasons. First reason is, modern slavery is really bad. And it's a really big problem, and we should all be doing our best to deal with that problem. The problem in context is there's over 40 million slaves, modern slaves, in the world. There are 25 million of them are in forced labour. So there's 40 million, and when you think about sex workers, child trafficking, and forced marriages, that's not generally in people's supply chains, but the rest is, and that's the 25 million. And of those, 4 million, governments doing it to people around the world. Governments are putting people into forced labour in countries like North Korea and countries like that. So it's a big problem, and that puts it in context. This is a little bit about the law. So we've got some legislation. We've got the Modern Slavery Act Commonwealth, Modern Slavery Act New South Wales, which kind of came first, but didn't actually start till the beginning of this year, the New South Wales Act. So it was a few months before the Commonwealth Act, but the Commonwealth Act was, well, they got it right. So it could start straight away. The New South Wales Act was really bad, really broken, and needed to have reviews and needed to be fixed, and it's been fixed. And it started 1 January this year, and it applies to the state of New South Wales, mostly just government though. State government, state-owned corporations, and local councils. The Modern Slavery Act Commonwealth applies to the Commonwealth government and corporations with a revenue over $100 million. As I'm sure, sorry, $100 million, jumping ahead. And so I'm sure we probably all know. So that's who's covered. And what they have to do is look at what they're buying, where it's coming from, what sector it's in, where the risks of modern slavery are, and then try to deal with those risks and implement things in their organisation that looks at where they're buying things from, trains their individuals, their personnel, deals with their contractors and their subcontractors, and has policies around all sorts of things. Procurement, equality, whistleblowing, lots and lots of policies that go to modern slavery. So that's the law. As I say, 2018 Commonwealth and New South Wales, fairly big news at the time when it started off earlier this year. Didn't really do what it was meant to do though, the New South Wales Act, but anyway, maybe in time it will. So this is the sort of the update now, modern slavery kind of update. So this year we had a very interesting report from the Human Rights Law Centre who issued a study, again hyperlinked when you get these slides, about, well, how are we doing? You know, what are corporations actually, is it working? Are people paying attention? Are they doing a good job or a bad job? Well, you can probably tell from just looking at these statistics that it's not a good story. 77% of companies that they looked at in terms of their modern slavery statements didn't comply with the legislation. 52%, more than half, failed to identify obvious risks. If you're buying something in your supply chain from China and you don't mention forced labour and what's going on in Uyghur, then you're missing something really obvious, right? And so, that was what they found, things like that. And things like they didn't talk about COVID. And COVID's had a big impact on modern slavery. It's sort of forced people into hiding, and it's put a lot of pressure on people, and it's enabled people actually to do a lot of bad things as it relates to modern slavery, the incidence of COVID. And lastly, only 27% of companies were assessed as doing anything effective. So that's a pretty woeful sort of report, really, and obviously it says that we've got to do a lot better. And it's the same in the UK. So the UK passed their act in 2015, and it's a similar story. It's a rubber stamping exercise, it's a tick and flick. Companies don't really care, they just want to comply. And why don't they care? Really, because yes, it says it's mandatory, but there's no teeth to it. There's no penalties. So you can, if you don't comply, you know, you just go on the naughty list, and people aren't looking at that anymore, really. So it's a big deal, but that's why the compliance levels are so low. And there's a lack of understanding as well. What the report looked at was, we talk about mandatory reporting, but it isn't really. And so make it actually mandatory. Make mandatory reporting mandatory, basically, is what was one of the recommendations. Require companies to take action. So the legislation doesn't do that. It just says, have a look at what you're doing, and then tell us about it. But it doesn't actually say you have to take any action. That legislation misses that sort of obvious link. Make sure people who are exploited can access justice, provide guidance to high-risk sectors, ban imported goods, and I'll come back to that in a minute. That's a kind of watch this space. And reward companies. So this is a good thing. So people that are doing good in modern slavery and in sustainable procurement, let's reward them with more government contracts, because the government can do that. Government's in control of its buying power, so let's give them a boost when it comes to assessing their proposals, for example, and make that part of the selection and make it worth their while. Reward people. And then there are recommendations for companies as well. Implementing human rights due diligence, looking at the worker themselves, making sure we responsibly source, and the big one is remediation processes. If you haven't yet come across the Commonwealth Government's guidance on modern slavery, there are some really good things there as well. So the Commonwealth Government, Border Force and Home Affairs have published guidelines and policies on modern slavery, and they're very, very, very good. And they've also published some things on remediation as well, which is kind of like the next step, is what you do when you find it. Now, Queen's Speech, 2022, if you missed it, you can still get it on YouTube. I think it was delivered by Charlie, but what it talked about, so this is in the UK, I won't dwell on the UK, I haven't got much time left, I want to get to some questions, I'm not sure if we have any, but if we do, I want to do that. But what they said was let's broaden reporting entities, let's require the statements to be published, let's have a single reporting deadline. So at the moment, here in Australia and in the UK, it goes with your financial year, whatever that might be, and you can basically pick a date. Most people, it's obviously end June, so it's a June, July, June. But it could be April, March, if you're sort of, or it could be a calendar year. So, you know, the different entities. That makes it very difficult to sort of keep up with. Mandate, board approval. Here's the big one, civil penalties. Penalties for not complying, and mandate the details to be put into the statement. The details in the statement listed there, a bit like what, this is the UK, like I say. It's a bit like what we have here. Structure of company, nature of company, policies, due diligence processes, assessment of risks that have been done, assessment of effectiveness of steps taken, and training resources for staff. So, legislation in Australia has a 5-year review. Every act has to be reviewed every 5 years, and guess what? 5 years is coming. 2018 is when modern slavery started, so 2023 is 5 years. The review process has started, as you can see from this slide, and what they'll be reviewing is, how's it going? Well, as we can see from the report that I just flicked up, not very well. Are people complying? Well, no, they're not really. So what do we do about that? Civil penalties may well be coming for non-compliance. They might look at the criteria, the 7 criteria that need to go into your modern slavery statement, and see whether they're the right ones. Add some, change some, make it a bit more effective. Is $100 million the right threshold? Should it be 50? It's 36 million pounds in the UK. $100 million is very high. There's only 4,000 companies actually in Australia that get there. And that's not many, right? Now, a lot of people are doing sustainable procurement and modern slavery, a lot of companies, whether they have to or not. But if you actually just took a compliance hurdle, there's only 4,000 companies. That's not many. And should it be run by an independent body is the next one, like the New South Wales Act. So is it right that something as important as modern slavery is run by a department of the government? And it's a little bit ironic, really. If you're a modern slave in Australia, likelihood is you're here illegally. The last place you're going to go and complain about that is Border Force. So it's a little bit ridiculous, right? So there should be an independent body. Forced labour bills for Australia. So this is the whole WIGO problem. We've had 2 attempts at it. The forced labour bill, which will ban imported products from overseas if they come from forced labour. It's there, it's in the UK, it's been passed, it's in the US. We've had 2 attempts, failed attempts at bills here in Australia, and they haven't gone up, obviously, but it will come, it has to. And the incoming Labor Party have talked about a whole lot of things, about things like modern slavery, independence of it running, lowering the threshold, penalties, and this forced labour aspect. So it will come. It's on the list. They've got a long list of legislation to pass. So watch this space. 2 things. The Act's getting reviewed, updated, boosted, hopefully, and will be more effective. And we will have forced labour bill or bills in Australia soon, which will then become Acts, which will then become law. And what that means is, if you are a company that imports anything derived from any aspect of forced labour, and anything from Uyghur is that, then you will be up for penalties. It's a strict liability. There's no excuse. That's going to happen, and that's the way it was drafted before, and that's the way that it will come through. Well, I've got a few minutes left. If there are questions,
yep.
Oh, great.
All right. The most popular question, you can put a clause into a contract covering modern slavery, but how do you actually audit a company to confirm if it exists or not?
Well, the clause can say that. So you can put a clause in that says you have to comply with modern slavery. Now, it's a bit tricky, this, right? So there's a couple of aspects to this. One is there's clauses in every contract that say you've got to comply with all laws. So yes, in a way, you should put a clause in that deals specifically with modern slavery, but making a company that doesn't otherwise have to comply with legislation, which was only intended for large corporations, adds to their compliance hurdle, adds to their costs, and is it appropriate? The government's decided $100 million revenue is appropriate, so is it right that we put it on a $5 million a year company? So that can be a bit harsh. But if you are doing that, so most clauses say, if you are required to comply with the Modern Slavery Act, you must comply with it. And that's appropriate, obviously, right? But it's no different to the clause that's in every contract, you must comply with all laws, really, because if it applies to them, they've got to comply with it. Anyway, the clause can say, I can at any time parachute into your company, interview your workers, make sure they're paid properly, and have a look at your wage slips and your employment contracts. And if the other party agrees to that, then that's what can happen. Now, obviously, there's confidentiality, privacy, and other aspects to that, but you can do anything in a contract, and I've seen plenty of contracts that allow for exactly that.
Okay, thank you. All right. For many in the room today, Modern Slavery Act compliance is not mandatory. With the limited resources we have, what's one thing we can do?
You can just be a bit more conscious of what you're buying and where you're buying it from, really. That's really it, and that's what the Act actually requires you to do, but obviously it goes to a lot more levels than that. But that's what we should do, and that sort of takes because if you're going to buy cheap, and if cost is all it is, then you will be buying from places like North Korea, as I mentioned, and China and Uyghur and everything like that, and that will then be feeding modern slavery. You don't have to double your costs to make the world a better place, but you might just have to pay a little bit more. And if you can, and that sort of it lands well with your organisation, that's understand your supply chain. High-risk countries, and there's plenty of resources for this. Countries are just the obvious ones, so they're in Africa and they're in certain parts of Asia, and they're the countries you'd all know: the DRC, Congo, all of those. Whilst we're talking about that, that's where we get cobalt from, for example, it's a conflict mineral. It's in all computers and phones. So it's really inappropriate or wrong or impossible for any company. And I've seen people say, you've got to give me a stat deck that says there's no modern slavery in your supply chain at all. Nobody can say that. You individually can't say that. Neither can I. This thing here that I'm holding, would there be something in here that's come from modern slavery? It's just, unfortunately, the way the world is. So asking people to sign off on the impossible is not right. But back to the question, look at what you're buying, things like electronics, garments, fish and things like that. But those are sort of the big ones, manufacturing. Look at those and where they're coming from, and that will then change it if you can. So that's the easy thing.
Well, just finally, Scott, can we just finish with what is the definition of a modern slavery?
Well, that's a good question, right? So modern slavery is defined in the Act, and people say, what's modern slavery as distinct from slavery? And obviously, when we think about slavery, we think about generations ago and what happened with Africans in America, for example, or indigenous people here and that kind of thing. And we think of people in slaves and that kind of stuff, working for free, being whipped. That's not really what modern slavery is about. Modern slavery is about people who are you can't always often see them. So they're there, but you don't know that they're modern slaves, so they might be working in a building site, for example, but they are working illegally. And the person who's employing them takes advantage of that and will be underpaying them, possibly co-locating them together, a group of workers, for example, in a bedroom, 10 of them sleep in there, not speaking English, so they don't actually enable themselves to get out. So it's really anybody who is doing anything against their will, and they're in fear of either physical threats or mental threats or coercion or their families. So anyone, and there's a whole lot of that going on. That's really what forced labour is. But what modern slavery isn't is underpaying people or not having the appropriate WHS, right? We've got laws for that, the Fair Work Act and the Work Health and Safety Act, that deals with that. That's not modern slavery, it's just a really bad place to work. Modern slaves, there has to be an element of doing something forcibly and against your will. So it's more than that, right? So there's grades. There's perfect conditions, bad conditions of work, but not unlawful in terms of modern slavery, and then there's modern slavery. So that needs to be understood. All right, thank you.